I think it's pretty safe to say that selecting the right paints for your watercolor palette can be a dizzying affair. On their website, Winsor & Newton currently lists 109 different professional series paints to choose from. Holy smokes, that's a lot of options. What do you really need, and what can you live without? I'll venture to answer those questions and a few more in this video. Now, I primarily paint birds, but the paint color suggestions that I'll give here for transparent watercolor apply to pretty much any subject matter. I've used these same colors for all sorts of different subjects, including portraits, landscapes, still lifes, botanicals, cartoons, and medical illustrations. In the end, what you're painting matters less than having a complete toolkit of colors that will allow you to render pretty much anything in transparent watercolor. If you're painting with oils, acrylics, gouache, or something else, well, my color suggestions would differ. My basic suggestion is to have 15 different colors, which may sound like a lot, but considering there are over 100 options, it doesn't seem terribly excessive. And remember, these 15 should allow you to render virtually anything. In grade school, we were all told that there are 3 primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, and that with those colors you can mix all the other colors. Well, in theory, yes. In practice, yeah, not so much. When it comes to watercolor paints, you definitely need more than 3, and the answer really lies in the color wheel and what pigments are actually available. In looking at the good old color wheel, it seems like you're pretty safe mixing intense, saturated colors within a quarter of the wheel. If you go past that, things start to get muddy or grayed out. Now, at times, that desaturated color is exactly what you want. But as an example, if you're trying for a really saturated, intense purple color, you'd be better off using quinacridone magenta and ultramarine blue than cadmium red and phthalo blue. In other words, as you mix adjacent colors on the wheel, you'll maintain your color saturation better. As you move across the wheel, you start to desaturate your colors. If you always want to have saturated color options possible, then you need to avoid grabbing colors that are too far across the color wheel. This leads to a palette with several blues, reds, and yellows, each leaning a little bit in color direction. In each of these cases, an individual paint will prefer to mix more saturated, intense colors in one color direction and a little less saturated in the other. You always have the option of going across the wheel with a near perfect complement or split complement if you're looking to desaturate your colors. I'll explain that in more detail when we get to the specific colors that I suggest using. In general, I suggest what I call a Spectrum Plus palette of 15 colors, which is basically a rainbow of options plus a few colors and selected earth tones. I have some colors that aren't completely necessary on my palette, but they do speed up mixing. So here are the paints that I use. Winsor Violet or Dioxazine Purple. This is a staining pigment. You can mix purples, but this is a mix-free option with great dark color. For me, this is definitely a go-to when mixing shadows. It's a beautiful addition to browns. I do use a lot of purple. You can get a similar color by mixing quinacridone magenta and French ultramarine, but this is so handy and I use it so much that I always keep this on my palette. French ultramarine blue, PB29. This is a granulating color, and this blue mixes towards the purple violet side, making intense saturated purples and violets with rose madder and quinacridone magenta. When mixed with yellows and oranges, it makes for beautiful desaturated greens. Its granulating nature means it may lift when glazing if you go dark early on. Skies and other areas may show this granulating sedimentary nature of the pigment, so if you want super smooth, this may work against you. On the other hand, that granulation sure can be a beautiful effect. Cobalt blue, PB73, is another granulating blue and is semi-transparent. It's extremely permanent. It's almost the same color as ultramarine blue. Cerulean blue, PB35. This is another granulating pigment. It isn't always on my palette, but it can be really nice for skies. A little more on the green end of the blues, it's a bit like a dramatically less intense phthalo blue. Not a go-to color, but I do use it now and again. For the next two colors, I should give a warning. Phthalo pigments are kind of like that friend that you have with a huge personality. Loud and funny, bigger than life, and lacking that gene that tells you when you should be quiet. Perfect for some situations, but most often enjoyed in small amounts or buffered with other friends to take some of the edge off. So these phthalos are Winsor, or phthalocyanine blue, PB15, staining pigment. It's almost an obnoxious color if used straight out of the tube, but when mixed, it's super handy color that I use all the time. This blue leans toward the green side of the spectrum and mixes beautiful, intense, saturated greens if you want them. When mixed with reds and pinks, it makes very nice desaturated purples. Winsor or phthalocyanine green, PG7, is another staining pigment. And it's also another almost obnoxious color if you use it straight out of the tube. As someone who paints a lot of foliage, I use this all the time. Almost always knocked back with a warm to bring it back to reality. When mixed with permanent alizarin crimson, phthalo green makes a great blackish color with a lot of personality. Here's another color that I keep on my palette but is not strictly necessary, and that's sap green, which is PG36 and PY110. It's a staining pigment. Not always on the palette, but it makes for much faster mixing of many grasses and leaves. It's a very handy shortcut. Now for some yellows. Lemon yellow, PY175, is a staining and transparent color, which I really love. It's very pure, if ever slightly on the green end of the yellows. Another yellow that I always have on my palette is cadmium yellow pale, or cadmium yellow light. This is PY35. It's a staining opaque pigment, and this yellow leans toward the orange side, and it's great for adding warmth to greens and browns. This is one of the few paints that I use that has some opacity. I seldom really notice it unless it's glazed in late in the painting. One word of warning, be careful with cadmium paints. You don't want to ingest or breathe these in, so no licking your paintbrushes. Come on, that's a bad idea no matter what paint you're using. Seriously though, think twice before using any of the cadmiums in an airbrush, even with the respirator and good ventilation. Cadmium is a potentially carcinogenic chemical if inhaled. Another not strictly necessary pigment that I like to keep on my palette, but you don't really need, is Winsor Orange, which is PY35 and PR108. It's a semi-opaque paint and is not strictly necessary pigment, but I use it a lot because it's handy for flowers and it speeds up mixing. Like cadmium yellow pale, this is one of the few paints that I use that has some opacity. It seldom really is noticeable unless it's glazed in late in a painting. If you're looking to save a few bucks, this is one you can mix. Now for the reds. Winsor Red, PR254, is a transparent staining red, and it's a great, fairly neutral color. Other options you could use are cadmium red, PR108, which is opaque, granulating, and staining, which is another fairly neutral, or cadmium Winsor red, PR254. They're virtually the same, but with no health warnings. Another red that I always have on my palette is permanent alizarin crimson. It's a staining pigment, it's transparent. It's on the cool side of the reds. It is a must-have pigment that I use all the time. Be sure to spend the extra bucks and buy permanent alizarin crimson and not the more fugitive, non-permanent option. It's a great color when mixed with phthalo green to make super dark near blacks. It's also wonderful for making desaturated purples. There are a few colors that were never on my art school paint supply lists, but I find those to be must-haves if you're painting birds, fish, and insects, and botanicals, or anatomy, and a lot of illustration work, and they're just fun to use. I like having two different kinds of pinks. I suggest using quinacridone magenta, which is PR122. It's a transparent pigment, and this is a great hummingbird and flower color, and it's awesome for mixing purples. And then you can choose either rose madder or opera rose as other options. Those are RP122. and they are granulating. And they're staining. They're not as permanent as other colors, but it's a great hummingbird and flower color. Now we're off to the earth tones. For ages, I found earth tone paints to be really boring. And really, there are a lot of fantastic brown options, but really, browns are basically desaturated reds, oranges, and yellows of some sort. And you can mix almost any brown with your spectrum colors that we just listed, but using two browns as a starting place is much faster than mixing those paints. And these paints are cheaper and extremely light fast. Browns, when mixed with blues, greens, and purples, make for some just fantastic grays with wonderful personality. So the browns I suggest using are burnt umber, which is transparent and extremely permanent, burnt sienna, which is transparent and extremely permanent. Indian red is a color that I've been using a ton lately. It's opaque and it's granulating and extremely permanent. A wonderful color when mixed with purples and blues to make darks. Raw umber is another color that you should have on your palette. Transparent, it's granulating, extremely permanent. And yellow ochre is a go-to color. Granulating, it's extremely permanent. It's great starting pigment for Caucasian skin tones. It's wonderful for mixing desaturated greens. And there's some other colors that I don't always have on my palette, and those are lamp black, which I pretty much only use for pupils on some but not all paintings. Previously, I always used a mix of alizarin crimson and phthalo green for pupils, but that tended to mix and end up being shiny when it dried occasionally, which looked kind of weird, whereas lamp black always stays matte. I'll also use it when I make sepia-toned artwork, which is pretty infrequent. White's another color that I never have on my palette, but I do own it, and I very, very occasionally will use it opaquely to spritz on snow effects if I'm doing a winter painting. So do you need every single one of these colors? Well, maybe not. And not for every painting. It really depends on what you're rendering. This is the selection that I found has pretty much covered all of my needs for the last 40 years. That being said, remember that working with a limited palette can actually be a good thing and can make for some more harmonious and interesting work. So that brings us to a section that I'd call colors to avoid, and there are definitely some colors that I would say to avoid using. When I went to art school, our first painting class in art school was watercolor. After handing out his paint list for the class, our professor said that if we already had any paints, he'd have a look and let us know what was worth using. In addition to being a great painter, the guy also had a great sense of humor. There were 3 colors of paint that he suggested putting in the trash, not on your palette. Those were black, white, and Payne's gray. Now, I've seen great paintings that have been done with some or all of these colors, but they're rare. Here's the reasoning of why I suggest not using these colors. Black. Okay, I'll backpedal for a second. Yes, there are paintings with 2 blacks that are just awesome. John Singer Sargent loved black, and he could use it to perfection. Most of us, though, are not of his caliber. Using black for shadows and other dark areas tend to rob things of sophisticated color. Black always has a way of dulling and sucking the life out of colors when mixed. Using black for shadows is common in beginner work, but the logic of it usually fails in most situations. There's almost always some reflected light from somewhere filling in those shadows, imparting an actual color that's far more interesting to look at than black. White. When doing transparent watercolor, rather than mixing in white paint, learn to use the white of the paper and embrace the transparent nature of watercolor. Looking at great watercolor painters like Winslow Homer will show you how they use the white of the page to set up contrast and subtle transparencies to make the paintings almost glow. If you're using white paint, it tends to never match the paper quite right, and the paint looks like it's sitting on top of the page. In art school, people would often use opaque white for highlights in a painting, and we called it bird pooping because unless it was done absolutely perfectly, it looked a little bit like a bird may have added its own sort of signature to the painting. Payne's gray is another one I would say not to use. This color isn't necessarily awful, but it's definitely overused and can make work look kind of amateurish. Why? Well, It's used a lot in formula painting recipes. Not sure what to use for a shadow? I'll open up the Payne's Gray and use that. Now, the general idea of Payne's Gray isn't bad. It really is just a desaturated blue, but you'd be better off mixing your own toned grays that are specific to your scene. You'll avoid the same look that everyone else uses. Part of the Payne's Gray problem comes from the fact that it's made with black added to the ultramarine, often with some red or violet in the mix. As we discussed earlier, black often sucks the life out of other colors. So there you go. That's the basic color palette that I'd suggest for watercolor, especially for birds and wildlife. With these basic colors, you should be able to mix virtually anything you need. By the way, it's completely great to use other colors. If a tube of your favorite color isn't strictly necessary but inspires you to create, well, that alone is a great reason to have it on your palette. Do you have a go-to color that you always use? Let us know in the comments. Well, thanks for watching. I put a link in the video description below to a newsletter that I started with some tips and other watercolor information if you're interested in signing up. I hope you have a chance to get out the watercolors soon.